This is Hear Me Out. I'm Celeste Headlee. In the perennial battle between the nerds and the jocks, it seems like the nerds may have won. At the very least, the nerds have won an enormous influence over our lives. The Zuckerbergs, the Musks. The nerd archetype was once a lovable underdog, someone brilliant, someone worth rooting for. But the Zuckerbergs and Musks of the world aren't exactly well liked today, so the question becomes, did nerds win the culture war, and are they the villains now?
These were all fantasies that a middle schooler would sketch in a loose leaf notebook and then forget about and outgrow. But once you get enough power and wealth, if you haven't outgrown them, then returning to them, that is a new idea. And you don't need to go to billionaires to find it.
Ian Bogost, author and game designer, joins us in just a moment.
I'm Elise Hugh.
And I'm Josh Klein, and we're the hosts of Built for Change, a podcast from Accenture.
On Built for Change, we're talking to business leaders from every corner of the world that are harnessing change to reinvent the future of their business.
We're discussing ideas like the importance of ethical AI or how productivity soars when companies truly listen to what their employees value.
These are insights that leaders need to know to stay ahead.
So subscribe to Built for Change wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to Hear Me Out. I'm Celeste Headlee. We are, as a society, now past the point where the nerd gets the girl, and that, in and of itself, is the happy ending. Like, that's enough. And look, that's probably a good thing. It's enough of a cliche, for one thing. And our understandings of romance and gender and heroism have all evolved since those days of the Brat Pack. But I want you to spend just a moment and think about the favorite lovable nerds and geeks from current pop culture. Your Sheldons, your Urkels, your Chucks. Ask yourself, do these guys really exist in 2023? And if they did, would you want to hang out with them? If society's most prominent real nerds are any indication, the answer may be no. Ian Bogost is an author and video game designer, and he joins us now. Welcome.
It's great to be here.
So instead of me speaking for you, we reached out to you because you wrote a piece in The Atlantic that was called "The Nerds Are the Bullies Now," which we sort of summed up as like, maybe we shouldn't be rooting for the nerds anymore. Is that kind of a fair summary?
Yeah, I mean the nerds won the culture war in a way, and they were supposed to rescue us from the bad vibes of jock life or of hedge funder life or whatever it was, and instead they kind of turned out to be just as bad, if not worse, than all the bullies we were accustomed to.
We also found this op-ed in the New York Times that's written by Jennifer Wright. And her headline was "Jocks Rule, Nerds Drool." and I wondered, I imagined the two of you sitting over coffee because she was pointing out that there's so many stories coming out of the tech world at this point, allegations of sexual harassment, all these stories of misogyny, just so many upsetting stories coming out of tech companies, even the private lives of many of these so-called tech geniuses, that it sounds like exactly the sort of thing that you are pointing out in your op-ed. But why, at this point, are the nerds no longer the heroes, do you think?
Yeah, well, they gained too much wealth and power. That would be the simple answer. If memory serves, that Jennifer Wright piece was maybe from, 5 years ago or so. So it's
I think it was like 2018.
Yeah,
I'm not looking at it, but yeah.
This has been going on for a little while now. And you might say, anytime anyone accrues a power through wealth or through influence, or both, that they can't help but abuse it, that there's sort of no hope that the heroes, the underdogs, remain heroes. And that would be one way of looking at the problem, that we used to hold up nerds, geeks, whatever you wanted to call them, as a defense against hegemony, right? Against a kind of established power structure in which the finance bros or the jocks or the fraternity guys or whoever it was, right, were the bad examples of behavior and of aspiration. And you're supposed to use your brain instead and be smart, and science and knowledge and technology would win out over brawn and might. That was a story that we used to tell ourselves. And maybe that story was just wrong. It was never about brains versus brawn. It's just a matter of who has power, who controls the conversation, but also who has the resources with which to rule, not just politically, but culturally.
Okay, so, I mean, let me start first with the gendered portion of this, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, it's clearly gendered.
Oh, yeah.
As many of the pieces that I read, and there are a lot of them, pointing out sort of this phenomenon about mean nerds.
Yeah.
They always use as examples guys.
Yeah.
Elon Musk, Zuck, all of them. And we aren't talking about mostly the females here. So what do you make of this idea the nerds we're mostly talking about are male?
Yeah. I mean, the gendered conflict of power is one of legend in a way. You harken back to these either kind of mid-century portrayals or 1980s John Hughes style representations of American, culture, and gender roles are fixed. They're very, very strongly delineated, and the conflict between men and men is often fought over women, right? And it's assumes, right, that what it means to be in power is to be male and in power. So there's absolutely no question that we still live under this, despite all the progress that gender equity might have made, that we still live under an assumption or a reality in which male dominance not only remains strong, but also is driving the stories we tell ourselves about what's possible. And there is another side to this conversation, which is about the idea that women might overtake the male presence, right, in whether it's in the technology world or elsewhere, and bring an alternative to the sort of bad sentiments of masculine identity. That conversation is also ongoing, but nevertheless, this is very, very binary gender split, especially when we're talking about a power in industry and power in government, remains strong, right? We still haven't shaken that off.
Okay, so I mean, it's hard for me to sort of wrap my head around the nastiness of nerds. I mean, I guess because we're using as examples these really famous nerds, and yeah, I know you're talking about to you what we're really talking about is power. Mm-hmm. So is what you're really saying is that sort of age-old wisdom that power corrupts? Is that really what we're saying?
I mean, it's funny if you go back and you look at the fantasy of the nerd underdog, overcoming the hegemonic jock figure, and I'm thinking of especially in cinema of the 1980s, the movies I grew up with and that were prominent at the time that computing and computing geekery was on the rise. Revenge of the Nerds or Real Genius or even Back to the Future in a certain way, which has this throwback to the mid-century, right? It's not as though the behavior of anyone was good, was worth modeling. All sorts of weird, perverse relationships, especially between men and women. The very idea that what makes you successful is winning over the girl in the first place, and that's a virtue to pursue, or no matter what you do to get there is justified. The idea behind overcoming power, by replacing it with the underdog figure, whether that's the nerd or someone else, was probably always a bad idea. It was always a broken notion, but it was nevertheless a driver of cultural imagination. And so then when the nerds started to win the battle for a cultural appeal and the idea of having a computer company or a technology business or just being having prowess at machinery was no longer a weird thing to do, no longer meant that you were stuck inside your head or your basement. It appeared as though that fantasy was becoming realized, and we sort of forgot, I think, about of course, the pop culture representations are just representations. They're just stories, but they were the stories we told ourselves about a certain kind of fantasy of flipping the bit on power, and not just power, but also value. What kind of figure you would want to be or surround yourself with or aspire toward. And so, you could say, well, power just always corrupts, and maybe that's accurate, but that doesn't get you very far. That's not a terribly insightful position to land on, because we had imagined that a very specific kind of power inversion, that sort of brains brawn dyad, that once that flipped, that something would change, that we would no longer be fighting with one another, that somehow reason would overtake snap judgment. And that kind of didn't happen. And we've never really come to terms with the fact that it didn't. And now that's sort of the job we have to carry out, is to understand, well, were we wrong? And in what ways were we wrong? And what kind of new fantasies or new desires do we want to build around aspiration for ourselves, for the generation of people that come after us? And it's hard to reinvent a whole culture's worth of values overnight.
I mean, I feel like as a female, I sort of feel left out of this whole thing.
Right.
Right? Like, this was never about me. And
Yeah.
I think of that movie Revenge of the Nerds, which so casually, includes a rape as sort of a victory.
Right. Terrible. Right.
Yeah, just the worst ever.
Awful.
Like this. Yeah, just the worst. But like this whole idea that there's this epic battle between the idea of masculinity, the difference, the battle between Thomas Jefferson and Attila the Hun, right? Like where I fit into this is clearly just as the spoils of war. But this idea that either one of them are the bad guys, to me, sort of leaves out the idea that we shouldn't be idolizing anybody.
Yeah.
No one is the hero.
Right. Yeah. And you could say, well, this this concept of idolization is, a fundamental tool or aspect of patriarchy in the first place, and the very reason that we have those sort of dreams or fantasies of great individuals, by which we often mean great men, is a part of the problem. And you'd be right. Right, that's absolutely the case. But there was, and there remains, a very strong drive to reconcile various kinds of masculinity, especially in America, which is largely the cultural context we're talking about that then exports that to the world. And it's absolutely the case that the role of the kind of weird, messed up role of men, our bad fantasies for ourselves and those we surround ourselves with, it hasn't been overcome. We haven't made much progress wrestling with it. And I think one of the reasons, this is a little bit of a left turn from, Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg, but one of the reasons you see a struggle in ordinary online life around masculinity is because we haven't resolved it. And I'm thinking here of 4chan or Redditors or, Jordan Peterson followers or whatever, who are all looking for a place to find a certain stable sense of self, and often of male self, of masculine self, in the wake of all of these power brokers, And it's been interesting over the past 20 years teaching at universities, teaching in technical disciplines in universities as the rise of the technical, the tech industry has been progressing during that period, to see the dreams and anxieties evolve, and maybe to see how little they've really evolved. My classes are still largely composed of men. Maybe there are more women in them. The kinds of dreams that are set for these students are defined by largely men and a certain kind of men in power, either at VCs or in tech companies. And even when you say, well, let's encourage women or people of color or other sorts of underrepresented individuals to get in, to find a foothold in this new economy, it's usually on the terms set by those who are in power. And you often hear all these stories of, how many fewer black-run startups or women-run startups, to use just that example, get funding or get support. And all of that, it comes from sort of the same basis of a certain understanding of what kind of success you have to have already had in order to pursue more of it.
So we have to take a break. I still have a lot of questions. We're talking to Ian Bogost about nerds and whether nerds have become the bad guys in the narrative story of our society. This is Hear Me Out, a podcast from Slate. I'm Celeste Headlee. We will be back in just a moment.
I'm Elise Hu.
And I'm Josh Klein, and we're the hosts of Built for Change, a podcast from Accenture.
On Built for Change, we're talking to business leaders from every corner of the world that are harnessing change to reinvent the future of their business.
We're discussing ideas like the importance of ethical AI or how productivity soars when companies truly listen to what their employees value.
These are insights that leaders need to know to stay ahead.
So subscribe to Built for Change wherever you get your podcasts.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. That's the sound of switching your business to Shopify, the global commerce platform that supercharges your selling. Harness the best converting checkout and same intuitive features, trusted apps, and powerful analytics used by the world's leading brands. Stop leaving sales on the table. Discover why millions trust Shopify to build, grow, and run their business. Sign up today for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/tech23.
And we're back. I'm Celeste Headlee. This is Hear Me Out, a podcast from Slate. And we're talking about nerds. Once upon a time, there was a kid who was picked on in school because he liked computers too much. And then he left school and he started working really hard on his computer. And then he created a software that everyone needed and he made tons and tons and tons of money and he became super cool. And then he started ruining the planet and he became the bad guy. I'm not talking about any particular person.
Yeah, it's an archetype, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah. That's the archetype. But to a certain extent, one of the reasons why anybody cares about nerds is because technology has become so ubiquitous in our society that many of these tech nerds are able to force themselves to be in the center of our viewfinders. Like Elon, I don't really think anybody would care about Elon Musk. I don't think anyone would give a good goddamn about him if he would stop buying up companies that forced his name and his picture to be all over our social media feeds. Frankly, I mean, that is truly what I believe. And so to a certain extent, I feel like one of the reasons nerds, and I'm using that term broadly, are even given as much attention as they are even the protagonists in any way, either as villains or heroes, is because they're making themselves that. They're putting themselves in the center of attention.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that the people who get attention get more attention, and we devote our attention to them, not necessarily because we want to, but because they're in the limelight. But there was a sort of very particular kind of archetype around the ideal nerdly figure, and Musk is an interesting test case for it because he seems to have kind of entered that archetype successfully and then departed it again at some point. Like, you remember when everyone compared Musk to Tony Stark, the fictional billionaire playboy industrialist
behind Iron Man.
Iron Man, right? And that's a fictional character. Let's put that out there. But it was a fictional character around whom we believe there was sort of collectively believe there was enough balance of interests and abilities that we could tolerate and even aspire toward that sort of station. Right now, it may have been totally wrong, but it was a comparison that was used. Being wealthy, being savvy, being able to speak in public, being the playboy figure, this sort of good with women was always very important to it. But someone who could make things and invent stuff. That was a sort of ideal position in a certain way. And whether or not Musk ever achieved that station is kind of irrelevant. It's more interesting that we stopped talking about him in that way, and why was that? And some of the reason is that the aspiration was wrong in the first place. Like, is Tony Stark really the dream you want to hold for yourself or your children or your friends? Well, no, it's a comic book, literally a comic book. Character.
And also, he's not even the most likable comic
Not
book
likable,
character.
but we held it out there as something that maybe would be a structure around which we could build these sorts of fantasies. But then at the same time, as people get more and more wealthy, more and more powerful, especially within the weird bubble of tech Silicon Valley style life, they become more and more disconnected from the ordinary world, of course. And, which is not to say that Stark as a fictional character was ever terribly connected to it. But the sort of strange actions and questions and assumptions that someone like Musk now makes are assumptions for himself. And they feel, more and more kind of out of line with many people's lived experience. He's, bought Twitter and sort of has been like redesigning it as a personal playground for his own wants and needs, which I guess is the prerogative of the very wealthy in some way.
He's also anti-Semitic and
there's all sorts of
misogynistic
problems, right? Like there's no end to the problems. But what we never really developed, I think, for these figures was a sophisticated, well-built out archetype that was achievable. Like, what do you really want out of your magnates? You want them to be a humanitarian, or not to be Philistines, to be connected to see the different perspectives and positions of varied people from different walks of life. And if we go back and look at the precedents of the very wealthy, like Bill Gates, for example, who never left the orbit of nerddom, but entered through his foundation and the way that he does philanthropy a similar, if distinctive, kind of way of exerting power, in which he appears to be giving away all his wealth, but only to his own foundation, which decides what's worth investing in and not, right? Is that better? Is that a better model? Maybe so, right? But if the problem at the end of the day is just wealth, just the accrual of all of this wealth and the power that comes from it, which is, by the way, I think it's a scale of wealth that we never could have imagined when we were fantasizing about the reconciliation or the overturning of the jock nerd a paradigm. It doesn't really matter. There's always going to be a problem so long as one person or a small cabal of them can be so decoupled from ordinary life and ordinary experience, they can just no longer see it clearly.
This is all, again, I hate to bring this back to my femaleness, but this is so difficult for me, Ian, because I don't understand what it's like to grow up male, and this whole paradigm of having to learn how to be a man, right? Are you going to be a jock? Are you going to be a nerd? Like, that is so foreign to me. I don't even understand why we have to teach people how to be a man. Like, none of my female relatives ever came to me and said, Celeste, I'm now going to teach you how to be a woman. Like, I don't, nobody ever couched any of their advice to me in like, be a woman, Celeste. Pick up that frying pan. Like, all of what you're talking about feels to me as a society as sort of male angst over what the male identity is. Is this wrong? Maybe I'm speaking out of a deeply, maybe this is my wokeness coming out. I don't know. I'm not sure,
even think it's not even wokeness, right? I mean, what you're saying is, I don't think it even rises to the level of some sort of controversy. It's just absolutely the case that we continue to play out this sort of weird, unresolved anxiety of masculine identity in America and in the world, and it persists. It persists despite the fact that there are all manner of kind of different incursions into that identity, different ways of of experimenting with gender and sexual identity. And nevertheless, here we are, still rehearsing these very old-fashioned ideas.
In a way, this is an odd episode of Hear Me Out, because normally I bring people on and we disagree in a civil and smart way without yelling at each other and without insulting each other. Instead, I read your piece. I've read it now several times because it came out a while ago and I had to refresh my memory. And instead, I've sort of brought you on and I'm trying to have you help me grapple with what we're talking about here, because I cannot get my mind fully around what this is. What is going on here? Why is this so difficult? And you're right. When we went back, as I was preparing for this conversation, this whole discussion about the villainy of nerds began. I saw the first op-ed, and there may have been some coming out before this, but I saw the first one come out in like 2004.
I mean, I'm sure you could trace them back 100 years.
I'm sure. I'm sure. I mean, come on, Thomas Jefferson. Talk about a villainous nerd. But like, for me, I'm just trying to sort of understand what's happening here. And you're talking in your piece about the declared fight between Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg.
Right, that was
I don't know if that's happening.
Well, as far as we know, it's not now. And it doesn't really matter whether it did or didn't happen, or it was or wasn't going to happen. What was important was that they were having discourse around it, and it could have. Like, I'm going to fight you, right? That was a way of conversing between these, unfathomably wealthy individuals. That was how they chose to talk about, right. That was how they chose to talk about their differences in public.
And I paid about as much attention to it, and I had as much care for that as I did when I was on the playground. I was like, oh, some teacher is going to have to come running out at some point. Like, that has nothing to do with me. I could not care less. Like, it has nothing to do with me. I couldn't care less, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I don't care. And yet these are people who have an outsized impact on policy, on politics, on economics. Like, I cannot... in some ways, I find it deeply unjust.
Let me throw out a couple mix-ins here. Just a couple observations that I think surround this whole discourse. One of them is the way that we have sort of infantilized a culture or attained a certain connection to childhood dreams. And I was thinking about this. So one of the things that Musk did a while back that I thought was relevant for the role that we're talking about, he was like, I'm going to make these flamethrowers or flamethrower-like devices. I think it was the Boring, company. He was trying to raise money for his tunnel digging apparatuses. He's like, we're going to make flamethrowers, and I'm going to sell these flames. Remember this?
Except he's not an engineer. He can't make stuff.
Well, yeah, it doesn't even really matter because the whole thing around it was this kind of G.I. Joe-like fantasy world. We're going to dig tunnels underground, and instead of having trains, Tesla cars will drive on these tunnels, or the Hyperloop, or the flamethrower itself. Like, these were all like fantasies that a middle schooler would sketch in a loose leaf notebook and then forget about and outgrow. But once you get enough power and wealth, if you haven't outgrown them, then returning to them, that is a new idea. And you don't need to go to billionaires to find it. All of the pop culture from my childhood, Star Wars, Transformers, all of that stuff. And it's not just the male-gendered stuff, too. We've now returned to it. We were supposed to be done with that and outgrow it and move on to adult affairs, right? Those were children's media. But we've persisted at them. We returned to them, and in fact, we spend a great deal of time and money collectively on these franchises that are now considered to be universal. I mean, the rise of Marvel, the rise of Star Wars, all of that also contributes. It's not just about the nerd thing, right? Although there was a certain nerddom in those toys and movies at the time, but rather the sense that we wanted to persist an experience of childhood and reclaim it in adulthood. That's something that has been happening and continues to happen. Maybe it's not fueling the fire, but it is contributing to this sort of ongoing perspective. Another thing that I would throw out there is the way that fame and identity and power and wealth have been made newly possible, the kinds of new types of wealth and power that the internet tools that folks like Zuckerberg and others have invented, where they bear fruit, where you can take advantage of them. So I'm thinking here in part of the rise of like the influencer economy, which is largely feminized in a way, right? Like the sort of Kylie Jenner, Kardashian, post-socialite attitude of, well, what fame means and what young people, especially young women, see as desirable about fame is very much attached to these very amplified notions of traditional female beauty or power. Like that's just contributing to all of the same patriarchal attitudes that we were just speaking about from another direction. So we have multiple forces that are reinforcing these stereotypes. It's not just that Musk is a kind of weird nerd with a bunch of money.
I mean, he is a weird nerd with a bunch
He
of
is
money.
that.
We have to take one more break. We will be back in just a moment to talk more about weird nerds with a bunch of money. I'm Celeste Headley, and we will be back in a moment.
Hi, I'm Janae Desmond Harris, Slate's Dear Prudence. I'm dropping in to tell you about a special discount offer on Slate Plus. For a limited time, you can start a subscription for just $5. That's right. For just $5, you'll get 3 months of ad-free listening on every Slate podcast, member-exclusive episodes and segments on shows you love, like this one, and unlimited reading on the Slate site. Best of all, you'll be supporting Slate's independent journalism. But hurry, this offer ends soon. Get 3 months for just $5 by signing up today at slate.com/podcasts plus. That's slate.com/podcasts plus.
We all need advice sometimes.
Right? Someone to say, I get it, I've been there too.
But often it's hard to know where to turn, which is where we come in. Hi, I'm Carvel Wallace.
And I'm Courtney Martin. We're both authors and journalists who love finding solutions to problems.
Every week on Slate's How To podcast, a listener comes on our show to receive advice from a world-class expert.
We've covered everything from parents with radically different politics to people learning to love their insecurities.
We've helped listeners breathe better, sleep better, and even have better sex.
Speaking of sex, we're all getting screwed by a warming planet. So we've also learned how to cope with climate change and how to say goodbye to our pets.
Life is messy and complicated, but we're all in this together, so let's help each other.
Look for How To from Slate wherever you listen to podcasts.
And we're back. This is Hear Me Out, a podcast from Slate. I'm Celeste Headley, and with me is Ian Bogost. And one more time, we're going to be talking about weird nerds. And I got to ask about Jocks. Because I wonder what you make of the argument that Jennifer Wright made. We talked a little bit about her op-ed that she wrote in 2018, which was called Jocks Rule, Nerds Drool. Now, she not only brought up the argument that nerds have become the bad guys, she also argued on the other side that at least in broader society, when it comes to the powerful and wealthy, more and more the jocks are becoming good guys. She mentioned LeBron James and all the charitable work that he does, Steph Curry. I'm trying to think of this. Colin Kaepernick.
Right.
I think she also mentioned Terry Crews and his work for those who have been sexually harassed and assaulted. What do you make of that particular argument?
So a controversial position to take on the sort of, good guy jock is that it is a reaction to the declining power of physical power, culturally speaking, right? That, and I'm not trying to like psychologize why Terry Crews or Colin Kaepernick do or don't do anything, but it's interesting that it arises at the same time as the rise of the nerds, right? So many of these athletes are, at least in America, are either NBA players or NFL football players. And we've seen a decline of commitment to sport in general, but to American football in particular, largely because of what we know now about brain injuries are wrought by that sport in particular, not just among the pro players. So, underneath all this is an interesting and complicated decline or shift of sport and our attitude about sport, even as sport remains enormously powerful. So that's something that's underneath this. I think to take a political or a social position as an athlete isn't new, but it's new that we recognize it as a pattern. This sort of change, or our perception that there's a change now, that there's this sort of socially active athlete, it comes alongside the understanding that there's enormous amounts of wealth that can accrue to the most popular and most successful athletes that they then have to figure out what to do with as a result. But also that sport is a social practice. That we didn't give sport just due in a way. We treated it as something that was extra social, that was outside of concerns of a broader kind of social fabric, when it never really was like that. And I think here about a slightly different fantasy that we've had for 100 or more years about like the sound mind and the sound body, this idea that an education or an upbringing ought to be both physical and mental, that you need the two together, and that they have to act in concert with one another, and that they also counterbalance each other. I say it's a fantasy because the best way, as I argued in the Atlantic piece, the best way to be both sound of mind and of body is just to be wealthy in the first place, so you can afford to be. But nevertheless, that idea that you are a physical human being living in a body in the world, that's something that the nerds or the nerd culture always wanted to overcome, and jock culture never did. So maybe the athletes are a little closer to that sense of the balance between ideas and being a physical actor in the actual material world.
So this may be perhaps where we begin to disagree here, because I find that although we can point to a whole bunch of ultra wealthy nerds who are jerks, they're definitely they represent a tiny sliver of what's basically a large population. Like, there's a lot of people employed in the tech sector who would most likely be classified as nerds. And then there are a lot of people who are wealthy nerds who are doing good stuff for the world. I mean,
sure. Say
what you will about Bill Gates, but, he is giving away a lot of money to try to solve real world problems. Some of my favorite charities receive a lot of money from things like Microsoft and from other companies as well. The Microsoft philanthropies give away tens of millions of dollars. And there are individual philanthropies among the tech companies that aren't doing evil, not to paraphrase the original Google motto, and are not, threatening to punch each other out and measure the size of their genitalia and all those other things. I mean, maybe we're just talking about, I hate to say this, but a few bad nerd apples?
Certainly we are talking about a few bad apples, but they're like really, really big apples. The gravitational pull of their presence and the drives and the aspirations that they define. Like these are important. The individuals we hold as cultural heroes, they serve as these beacons for what people think is valuable and worthwhile, and they structure our dreams in a real way. And there's always been ups and downs, and anytime you find a hero, there's later you're disappointed by them. That's sort of part of the discovery of heroism, is the discovery of the fallibility of the human character, which is delightful and important to also recognize. But the archetypes themselves are maybe part of the problem, that we were hunting for these sort of like molten cores of archetypes that were invented before us and that we inherited. There are good nerds and bad nerds and good jocks and bad jocks, but even talking about goodness and badness may lead us astray. Even philanthropy, like we don't want to measure people simply in terms of the amount of wealth that they accrue and then give away into structures where they determine who is worthy, right, of receiving aid, which is just as true of LeBron James and Steph Curry as it is of Bill Gates, even though the scale of the money may be different, right? So perhaps part of the problem is this sort of, capitalist obsession with the accrual of wealth as the gate to cultural relevance, and then the performance, the sort of public performance of what you do with that wealth and that power as a test of your virtue. And if we could shed ourselves of that, all of that, whether it's jocks or nerds, we'd probably be better off.
Fair enough. Ian, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was great.
Okay, so this conversation was a lot. Like, it was a lot for me. You probably literally heard the gears turning in my head. And I wonder if it was a lot for you also to sort of grapple with. I would love to hear your thoughts on this, about why we still have this dichotomy of nerds versus jocks, whether nerds are the bad guys now. I want to hear your opinion, and you can share your opinion with us easily. Just email us. It's hearmeout@slate.com. A few weeks ago, we had Professor Bill Connell on the show to argue that Columbus Day was, and still is, an important holiday. That conversation got a little fiery, and it got you fired up as well. So before we go, we want to share a note we got from a listener who called themselves Sentient Being. Sentient Being wrote in part, "You basically destroyed the guest's 'everyone was doing it' argument and his 'it was 500 years ago' argument. One of, if not the main legacy that Columbus brought to the world was that kindness and acceptance gets you killed. Because that's exactly what happened. As true history is slowly being revealed, it seems that one group seems to be responsible for the vast majority of death and suffering in the world. Is celebrating that what we really want to do?" I don't think so, Sentient Being, and I think that question was rhetorical. Thank you for your email. We really appreciate it. We appreciate hearing from all of you, so keep sending those emails. Hear Me Out is a podcast from Slate. The show is produced by the sentient Maura Currie. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations, and Alicia Montgomery is VP of Slate Audio. I'm your host, Celeste Headley, and until next time, I want you to speak your mind, but I also want you to keep it open.
At Summit Hill Foods Professional, creativity comes with a side of convenience. See how our full range of sauces and bases can help you reinvent your recipes and your customer experiences. By simplifying the cooking process, cutting down on ingredients, shortening prep time, and reducing waste, you can bring even more flavor to your menu with a whole lot less of everything else. Learn more at shfoodspro.com/bigflavors.